Buenas noches, bienvenidos todas y todes. Don't be worried, we will continue in English. Welcome everybody to this very, I would say, emotional event, no? Because it's part of a long trip we did in order to put the wax cylinders, and particularly those related to Latin America, on the scene. And so thank you for all of you coming and joining us. And my name is Barbara Goebel. I am a social anthropologist by training. I'm the director of the Ibero-American Institute, and I have the job to guide a little bit, to moderate through the event, which is, I think, a quite nice journey. We will start with Maurice Mengel and a presentation of the Berliner Phonogramm-Archiv. For those who do not know it, it has birthday this year, 125 years of a collection that is quite unique in the world. So we will start with a short presentation on the Berliner Phonogramm-Archiv and its history, and also why it is so interesting and important. Then I will continue switching more to Latin America from a perspective of the Ibero-American Institute. As some of you might know, it hosts a large library, and we have complementary collection to those of the Ethnological Museum. And jointly, we have been working together, I would say, for a long time in order to connect those collections, but also embed them in a broader context. And then we will have, we will dive into I would say, Walter, in a very specific project, because Walter But let me first start by expressing my thanks, first of all, to the Ethnological Museum, and particularly to the Phonogramm-Archiv, for this long-term collaboration, and I hope it will continue in the future. We have to excuse Lars Koch. As you might have read in the newspaper, he is now combining two jobs. First of all, in Berlin, in the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art, but then also in the ethnological collections at the Kunstsammlung Dresden. So unfortunately, he cannot join us because he has an urgent meeting in Leipzig. But I would like to mention him because he has been always part of this long collaboration. And also Albrecht Wittmann, who also is somebody who always facilitated access to the collection. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank Martina Ojost-Buschmann, because she is the person behind the organization of this event, and as you might see, we put in the rear, we put some of the collections or examples of books and news and journals, and also photographs related to the wax cylinder, and she prepared that. And I would also like Beatrice Hoffmann-Ide, because she was also one person behind the scene helping us to make visible and put online the wax cylinder of Snetlage. So the first point I want to make, which is the logic of this event: collaboration matters, and we need networks. So without these joint efforts, this event would not have been possible. Without these joint efforts, the Berliner Phonogramm-Archiv would not have a future of 125 years more, at least. because it's not only about archives accumulating objects, it's about moving objects, sharing objects, that is the title of the event, and making them accessible and facilitating the reappropriation. I also, I want to emphasize that. Thank you also to Walter Maradiege, because he's quite busy with this new Eminöta project, and he volunteered to participate today in this event. So first, let me start by introducing, for those who do not know him, what I think is, not so many, introducing Maurice Mengel. He is the head of the Department of Media in the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art of the State Museums of Berlin, of Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz, so we are members of the same family. He studied Musikethnologie. That in English it would be music anthropology, but I know that there are some debates on, so maybe you just say the right term.
Ethnomusicology?
Ethnomusicology, I think, which is quite common in Latin America, but we have only very few positions in the German-speaking context. This is why I'm highlighting it. At University of Cologne, you do not have a Latin American connection. A little bit, because your PhD was on music archive from Romania and Bucharest, and the role in the socialist cultural policy until 1970. You joined the Ethnological Museum at 2006, and you have been organizing a lot of projects. I would like to highlight one, which I'm not sure whether I'm translating it correctly, but I'm just describing it: digitalization and visualization of object collections at the Humboldt Forum. So thank you for being part of these events, and the floor is yours. And just take us now to the 125 years of the history of the Berliner Phonogramm-Archiv.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me begin with this expressing my heartfelt thanks to Barbara Goebel, to Martina Urioste-Buschmann, and the whole team here at the Ibero-American Institute for moving the Phonogramm-Archiv one important step forward, I mean the online access, and for making this event possible tonight. As you already said, Lars Christian Koch sends his greetings to us. Unfortunately, he can't be with us tonight, and he called me this afternoon to say that he has some unforeseen urgent items on his agenda that require his attention. So, Lars Koch not being here, so he is our current still director in the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art, but he's also my predecessor. That's why I'm mentioning him here so much. He's not here, and that certainly is a disappointment, but perhaps we can also find an advantage in this situation, as that gives me perhaps a bit more space to highlight his role in the history of the Phonogramm-Archiv in the last 20 or so years. I joined his department, then it was the Ethnomusicological department, in 2004. So this information online is incorrect. It's 2006 was my second employment at the museum. That's what you find online, so not your... Anyway. So I guess I'm an eyewitness for over 20 years by now. Yeah. If we meet here on occasion of 125 years of Phonogramm-Archiv in Berlin, you probably expect me to talk about this history, about 125 years. Assuming that many of you already have a good idea of its history, let me see if I can present this history in a somewhat different light, highlighting a couple of less well-known aspects of this history. So now I start with the beginnings. We in Berlin usually begin this history of the Phonogramm-Archiv with the year 1900. That's what we do when we say it's 125 years. Yeah? Although admittedly, this is not the year the Phonogramm-Archiv was officially established. It's the year that psychologist Karl Stumpf recorded extra-European music with the phonograph for the first time. And that becomes the first recording of the Phonogramm-Archiv. Stumpf uses the opportunity of an orchestra from Thailand performing in Berlin to make his recording. And I have brought a tiny little piece of his recordings that Stumpf and his team made in September 1900 in the Zoological Garden of Berlin. These are the two probably white men that I'll be talking about a little bit. And this is, hopefully it works with the sound. A tiny little bit. So this group was here visiting. It was a commercial tour. They hoped to gain money with this tour and actually went bankrupt. They had trouble getting back to Thailand. The band leader is from the royal court, so it has a direct connection to the court in what was then Siam, now Thailand. Maybe you can recognize some of these instruments: xylophone, drums. There is a flute, I think, that we can hear, but we cannot see on the picture. Okay, let's see.
Es folgt die Walze römisch 2.
Das ist Albrecht,
es folgt die Walze römisch 2, 1a.
Sort of crackle. I stop here. Yeah. So I wonder how many times we've heard music from Thailand in these Latin American halls here. So much has been written and said about this recording over the years. It was, for example, the highlight of the 100th anniversary organized by Lars Koch's predecessor, Arthur Simon. Yeah? So let me only point out that surely Karl Stumpf knew about the plans to establish a Phonogramm-Archiv in Vienna, yeah? That took off 1 year earlier in 1899, yeah? So 1 year before Stumpf made this recording. And I don't have proof of this. I'm just assuming that since Stumpf was always well connected, he was a very network-aware scholar, that I assume he knew about the colleagues in Vienna and their Phonogramm-Archiv. Yeah? So he does miss the opportunity to establish the first sound archive, the very first sound archive in the world, but he still manages to be the first to actually record. Because the colleagues in Vienna, they weren't satisfied with the phonograph, they had to modify it and rebuild it, and it took until 1901 until they could actually record a recording. So there's this little rivalry between Vienna and Berlin going on to this day. Yeah, we have profited and learned a lot from the colleagues in Vienna, and I think Stumpf has too. This is why it comes that we commemorate the establishment of the almost oldest sound archive today, yeah, not quite the oldest sound archive. The other important person towering over the Phonogramm-Archiv's early years is, of course, Erich Moritz von Hornbostel. I had a photo here. He had actually studied in Vienna. I wonder if that's by incident or if it's by design. But he studied chemistry, and he comes to Berlin to become Stumpf's assistant at the Psychologisches Institut, at what is today the Humboldt University. So I find this always curious that comparative musicology comes from a psychology department. Yeah? I cannot possibly outline Hornbostel's relevance for the archive and for the discipline of comparative musicology in just a couple of minutes. And let me just say that without his tireless commitment, the Phonogramm-Archiv would not comprise today of about 30,000 cylinders with the 16,000 recordings. So the next chapter I call the Silent Archive. In the years after World War II, the Phonogramm-Archiv is defunct. For the most part, its collections are separated in one Germany, while the documentation is in another one. In the West, it's mostly Kurt Reinhardt, so it's another predecessor, who tries to reassemble the archive at what is today the Ethnologisches Museum. In the East, it's mostly Erich Stockmann, who speaks for the archive. This story remains still largely untold. Let me only say that with one notable exception, the archives remain, the halves, archives in plural, remain silent in these years, yeah? Or maybe two exceptions. Most of the recordings remain locked away in the Academy of Science in East Berlin. In spite of the archive being mostly silent, it is actively remembered. That's sort of the puzzle that I'm thinking about here. In the 1950s, comparative musicology, the old paradigm, established in part by Karl Stumpf and Erich Moritz von Hornbostel, gives way to a new paradigm. I call it ethnomusicology. Yeah? One of the founding documents of the new paradigm is Jaap Kunst's book with the title Ethnomusicology, a study of its nature, its problems, methods, and representative personalities. So this is actually often quoted as the first publication that has the word ethnomusicology in the title and at all. Yeah? And this book contains a lengthy history chapter, which is basically dominated by the Phonogramm-Archiv. So this establishes the precedent that the story of ethnomusicology, the history of ethnomusicology, is told beginning with the Phonogramm-Archiv. And in this tradition, it becomes common practice to trace ethnomusicology's history back to Stumpf and von Hornbostel and the Phonogramm-Archiv. Practically no PhD student in the US and many other countries could write their dissertation in ethnomusicology without knowing about the Phonogramm-Archiv in Berlin and reading his Hornbostel article on transcription. And during all this time, only very few people heard more than a couple of recordings from the archive. Another history of the Phonogramm-Archiv during the same period is much less well known. As I already said, during most of the Cold War period, most of the cylinders lay more or less locked away in the Academy of Science. In the GDR, in the DDR, yeah? There were some tape copies also in the GDR, and the question I asked myself is, why did nobody use the recordings? Yeah, so they were hard to play back. There were cylinders and there were negatives. That time, I think nobody knew how to play back the negatives anymore. Although some people say otherwise. But there were also some tape copies made during this very curious exchange program between East and West. But even those, as far as I can tell, were never used anywhere in the GDI. At least I couldn't prove this so far. Yeah? So the question remains, why is nobody working with the old recordings in the East? Why is it that Western ethnomusicologists invest, so not only German, but Western in general, invest significant resources into the Phonogramm-Archiv, although the recordings were mostly inaccessible, and into keeping its memory alive, like Kunst, yeah? While those in East Germany who were in possession of most of the recordings actually left it largely untouched. I think there's some German history, or rather Deutsche Geschichte, I don't know how to pronounce that, to translate that very well, left for us to explore here. Recently, ethnomusicologist Sidney Hutchinson looked into this part of history and wonders if Kurt Reinhardt's obsession with the Phonogramm-Archiv is perhaps a form of Wiedergutmachung after World War II. It seems likely that if we want to decolonize our archives, I think that is a topic later, yeah, we will have to look back at the colonial and maybe also the Nazi period in greater detail. So, we come already to what I consider today, yeah? And today starts after German reunification for me. As far as the story is told in our department, basically the day the wall came down, the then head of the department, Arthur Simon, got on the phone to get the cylinders of the Phonogramm-Archiv back. And he got them back. Yeah? He got them back from the Academy of Science. So for the first time since approximately 1944, the remaining cylinders and the documentation were together under one roof in Dahlem, at the Völkerkunde Museum it was called then. Again, according to the law in our department, Arthur Simon had asked somebody else to count a few thousand cylinders in the basement, but that person quit after with this insurmountable task, and it took the next person, Susanne Ziegler, to actually count them all and inventorize them, and she found out it was not a few thousand, it was 30,000, yeah, 30,000 items. So Susanne Ziegler stayed for almost 20 years, and it took quite some determination, as I already alluded to count, sort, and inventorize the cylinders. There was also considerable research done by Technical University to find how to digitize the negatives. I've mentioned that problem already. Then the cylinder collection of the Phonogramm-Archiv was recognized as part of the UNESCO Memory of the World program, thanks to our friends in Vienna. They helped with that. And the catalog with all the recordings of the Phonogramm-Archiv was published by Susanne Ziegler. It's there in the back of the room. You can look at it if you like. It's only available in German, but large parts of it are not hard to read. And then, of course, Susanne Ziegler also established a series with CDs with extensive documentation, some of which are also there. When Lars Koch became the head of the ethnomusicological department, as it was called, in 2003, I think he became the head. About that time, the second or third CD was about to be published. I don't actually recall the second or third one. Already before this time, the idea was to not only publish audio, but to accompany it with a lot of information. So there's a relatively extensive booklet. I think in other days, sometimes it might almost be a book. From the beginning, it's in multiple languages, and it's done in collaboration, your term, with local specialists. So it's not only somebody in Berlin listening to the recordings. Even in the beginning, before Lars came, we tried to work with to incorporate local knowledge. But with Lars, over time, this series, I think the collaboration got a lot more intensive. Yeah, that's the big change that I see in later years. I've said this. The selection, for example, on the CD and the commentary became increasingly dominated by the partners from source communities, and our role in Berlin became maybe smaller and smaller. I think our department was one of the first institutions in the Staatliche Museen that published substantial parts of their collections online. We were not the only ones, but we were one of the first. Yeah. So the Münzkabinett, I think, was before us. For example, in the EU project Bismarck, we did this work. It ended in 2008, and it made tens of thousands of musical items accessible online. It's a little bit like what we celebrate today. And 2008 was years before the establishment of the Deutsche Digitale Bibliothek. Yeah. So just to give a reference point. So the Phonogramm-Archiv has also been present, I'd like to say for decades, but I'm not sure what went online and what went offline on the portal of the Staatliche Museen zu Berlin. Yeah, but when this portal got a new overhaul in 2019, with much better design, they somehow forgot to put the audio there, right? So if you look at this from the outside, it looks like the museums forgot that they also have audio among their collections. Yeah. So this was a painful step backwards for us, but one that maybe we can partly correct with the activities that we're celebrating today, yeah? Where the Latin American recordings of our CD series find a new home at the portal, or not sure what's the best word, at the site here, digital collections of the Ibero-American Institute. So, one last comment that I have here in handwritten notes. In the last few years, perhaps our emphasis has shifted away from these digital tools, I feel, and has focused perhaps more on people than on tools or platforms. I feel that with the Humboldt Forum opening in the center of Berlin, that gave us more opportunities to collaborate actually with people and not only through media. And so I feel this has been a little bit of a focus in the last few years. Yeah, and in this context we have also worked with Walter, for example, right? And we hear more about this later. So this was my little overview, yeah, of 125 years, and I try to present it through a somewhat unusual perspective.
Thank you, Maurice, and I think it was already highlighting the logic of the archive accumulation, particularly in central knowledge infrastructures. The logic or the rationale is to put the microcosm in a microcosm. And the challenge that is somehow in the center of our event today is how to mobilize those collections. And I think you already highlighted that, and I will try to continue to highlight it, not so much as a presentation, but more as giving some insights. And as you can see here, later we will have the possibility for more dialogue. So why the wax cylinder collection, why the Phonogramm-Archiv is interesting for the Ibero-American Institute? As you might know, the Institute holds the second largest library in the world related to Latin America and the Caribbean, and for historical reasons we have complementary collections to the Ethnological Museum. But one of the challenges is that so far, despite the fact that we are in the same family, these collections are disconnected. So one of the great challenges is how to visibilize the collections, how to make them accessible, and how to mobilize them. And I think this is our joint effort. And maybe I should continue because you haven't mentioned that. That's a little bit the role of Latin America or of the Americas in the Phonogramm-Archiv, which is the largest Phonogramm-Archiv in the world. And you see that it's quite considerable also if you take into account Latin America. But one of the challenges Maurice Mengel was already addressing, why we have this phase of the silent Phonogramm-Archiv, is because if you're not cataloging it, you're not putting an identity to the object, you cannot find it. And if you cannot search it and find it, it does not exist. And I would say now, in times of digital transformation, if it's not in the digital world, it does not exist. So that is one of the challenges, and of course, as all anthropologists know, and this is also one of the challenges for decolonizing collections, is that to put an ID, which means to give a norm, a catalog, depending on the objects, the different rationales, also means to exclude knowledge. And if you recirculate those objects, what you see is an enrichment of knowledge. So it's very interesting to think about knowledge infrastructure from the perspective of the agency of people, but also the mobility of knowledge. And that is where we started our relation. With the CD series that has been already mentioned, published by Lars Christian Koch and Susanne Ziegler, producing not all the wax cylinder, but at selection and accompanying it like a contextualizing instrument or dispositif with a booklet where you have, of course, photographs and transcriptions. And for the production of those booklets, researchers from Latin America that have been visiting researchers at the Ibero-American Institute and also at the Ethnological Museum have been the key brokers. And what we are somehow commemorating today is the transition from the CD, which, as we all know, is an old dispositif, to the web page, to the digital collections of the Ibero-American Institute. And we went a little bit a reverse way. We have seen, for I think more than 10 years now, digital collections that is coordinated by my colleague Christoph Müller. But we did not have the possibility of putting all audiovisual materials, objects to say it somehow in an abstract term, on the digital collection. And since 1 year we can, or half a year we can. And that made possible what has been a long-term project for more than, 6 or 7 years, to make those wax cylinders more accessible. Because, of course, we have pirate copies circulating in whole Latin America. That is somehow also a circulation we are not taking into account as public institutions, but we also want to do it from our way, and how I will later explain a little bit. And what you see here are the 6 published wax cylinder series, the series of Lars Koch and Susanne Ziegler. And these 3 have been co-produced and co-financed by the Ibero-American Institute in order to enhance circulation, because we did not sell them, but we circulated them for free. What was much more difficult for the Ethnological Museum, because they are part of the state museums of Berlin and they have to sell their products. So you see already those disturbances that make so difficult circulation. So we had the autonomy to say we put money into this, and then we can circulate it for free and more broadly. And it was not a lack of intent, it was simply a lack of possibility. And these 3 others, have been produced only by the Ethnological Museum, so we entered the journey a little bit later. And for all these CDs, as I said already, researchers from Latin America have been the key brokers. Why this is so important? Do you remember that I said we have very few ethnomusicologists in stable position, or even institutes or education programs where you can study that? We have 8 professorships of anthropology related to Latin America and the Caribbean in German-speaking countries. 8 Lehrstühle. Yeah? We have 3,000 in Brazil. Now you see why, in order to mobilize these collections that are paid by taxpayers' money, so we have a responsibility, in order to circulate that, we need networks. We need collaboration, we need close cooperation with researchers from Latin America and the Caribbean. Otherwise, these collections are dead, silent and hidden. And this is why I'm so happy that Walter gained this highly renowned Eminöta program, because it visibilized also in the academic system that those brokers are key. Germany has the largest and densest landscape of museum archives and libraries in the world. and most of them are public, but in many areas of anthropology, not only ethnomusicology, but also social and cultural anthropology, ethnohistory, or legal anthropology, we have very few positions. So this is why my first point was networks matters, and this is why this event is so emotional for me, because it highlights the relevance of those networks. And we will later enter, I hope, Martina, that we will go into that link and I can explain a little bit more. Most of these CDs we have seen, and you can have a look at them. I don't want to circulate them because then it's more difficult for you to listen and watch, but then you can have a look. Most of these CDs, why we are joining complementary collections, most of these CDs are related to curators, researchers, or collectors that collected not only with the Phonogramm-Archiv recordings. They also collected objects, they made photographs, field notes, etc., etc. So, in some sense, these wax cylinder are prism of multiple relations and multiple objects. And to open them, to make them visible, also means to reconnect them with other media. So these are the anthropologists, curators, collectors. I cannot enter into details here because that would be too much. German-speaking, who have been very important and play an important role for collections, not only in Berlin, but also in Latin American countries, for example, Robert Lemaniche for La Plata, Argentina, or Emil Heinrich Snedlage, also with collections, or Heinrich Brüning for Peru. So we will not enter that, but we will enter a little bit the story of Brüning. So that will be... and these Latin American wax cylinders are part of broad multimedia collections. They're not an island, they're embedded in an archipelago of objects, to say it somehow. And I could now also show a slide of the collections of the Ethnological Museum, photographs, and of course ethnographic historical collections related to the wax cylinders. So they are part of an archipelago. But as you already said, the logic of the archives disconnected them, because we have in the different types of knowledge infrastructures different hierarchies of objects. For example, a library is very much shaped by the logic of the text. So the way how you catalog a book is the way how you organize all the collections we have here in the Institute. And we could now say the same for Ethnological Museum, where the wax cylinders and the audiovisual objects have always been at the borders. And this is why they have been forgotten. No? Only some numbers, and of course we have another situation, which is the coexistence of the analog and the digital, which also implies a lot of management difficulties. But I will not enter that. My point here is that they are not isolated, that they are part of an archipelago, but we cannot access that archipelago. It's somehow segmented. It's like a wrap. Yeah, it's separated. So our efforts, and the small event today is part of that, is to reconnect. And to reconnect is crucial in order to be able to recirculate. Because for indigenous communities, for Afro-American actors, these are not separated. We get a lot of visits of indigenous organizations, and there you can sense that. Also, if you go to the botanical garden, the plants in the botanical gardens of the Freie Universität Berlin, which is the largest herbarium related to Latin America in Europe, are not disconnected from the objects of the Ethnological Museum. Most of them made also by how to say, by plants. Well, no importa. And these are only some of the photographs of visits. This is from the Upper Xingu, and we are talking not only of representatives of indigenous organizations, but also indigenous academics. And what is their interest? To build their own archives, museums, libraries, if you want to say, on the place. So for them to get entry to the archipelago is fundamental, because it allows to document their own history. And I think that is our responsibility, but it has a lot of challenges, starting with a new digital platform that does not take audiovisual materials into account. Or here, for example, native speakers from Oaxaca looking at our linguistic material. Now, for all those visits that are always jointly organized, and not officially, but we always collaborate with the ethnological museums, anthropologists or ethnolinguists working closely with these communities are key. So this idea that we can connect directly is really not realistic, because we have here lots of sources of relevance for many ethnic groups, and we do not have an expertise. So again, the brokers are key. And what is the main demand you get? Access. It's not restitution. It's access. And possibilities to connect in the sense of facilitating access. And this is why I want to show very quickly how do we organize the access. The first decision we made long time ago is to discipline the objects. Because as you saw already in this previous slide, we have a lot of different objects. Those who are classical materials of a library, you all know, books, journals, for example, microfilms, microfiche, etc. And then we have all these wild objects that are very difficult to manage, that always have been at the border of the institute. And we put them into the center, but the way of doing it, and I think in the future we will have different instruments, was to discipline them, to organize them under the logic of the book. Why? Because we didn't want to have parallel catalogs. We wanted to have only one, and you see here with the icons that you have books, recordings, online documents, etc. If you do this, you lose information. Because, of course, photograph has to be catalogued in different ways, but what we wanted to have is only one entry point. That means visibility, accessibility, number one, prioritize. The second effort we did was we have a lot of special collections. There you can get a sense. And most of them are not catalogued, because to catalogue, for example, a manuscript takes a lot of time. But we did what we did in 4 languages to describe as much as we could and to reconnect to the online catalog. And also, there you can see, you can go into details, you can see different photograph collections, etc., etc. We update that, and you are also reconnected to the digital collections. In the case of the digital collections, we prioritized, also institutional decision, not beauty, but circulation, accessibility, because we put the digital object with all the metadata formats and all the interoperability formats, so that you can download that from any system you want. But it was a decision. Beauty, with a lot of fancy things, or accessibility and broad circulation. And again, these are institutional decisions, and you always gain and you always lose. So, and of course you have those technological changes. Now with artificial intelligence, this situation will completely change because you have other strategies, other instruments to search. Yeah, you will have that in the future, I think, more. But again, and language matters. We have everything in 4 languages. If you go, for example, to the digital collections of the state museums, it's 2 languages because they have too many languages to manage. But we do not have them in indigenous languages. And again, artificial intelligence helps because if you go to search systems now, you can have much more languages. But again, access and language is quite important. There are many studies on that. And that allows also to connect the wax cylinders. I'm thinking now of Karl von der Steinen, the Xingu expeditions, and the transcriptions of the diaries from Paul Ehrenreich. This is key basic material of the Xingu. But you can see here it's not only language, it's not only German, it's Sütterlin. And again, I hope that artificial intelligence will help that. We have that online and it's transcribed, and it's connected to maps, it's connected to photographs and to wax cylinders. So maybe we go now, I only have to click. I'm looking now with fear at, yeah, now we go to this historical moment to connect to our digital collections. Sounds easy. Let us put this online. What is the problem? Okay, that was my first thought. And then I started to understand that it is very complicated. First of all, the issues of, it's still moving.
As complicated as this here, yes. No, but we...
Maybe you can do it in different ways, yeah. I continue to talk, so it makes...
I have it opened already in the browser, so
the main challenge are the legal frames. Yeah? So we decided to declare this legally, together with the legal department of the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz, and of course the Ethnological Museum, to declare this not a publication, which was my first thought, but a source. If it's a publication, you have a lot of issues of intellectual property rights. Because you know that in a digital collection you can only put stuff that is free of rights, and that is 80 years after the death of the author. Yeah? So the first thing was, what is the legal status of this? My first idea was a publication, we scan it, blah, blah, check, easy, 5 minutes. No. A lot of intellectual property rights. Because for historical reasons, there are many authors, there are photographs with authorships, and we did not have all that information, neither the Ethnological Museum, how to access, how to contact people, etc. So what we did was to change the status. It is a source, and this is only a document for the source, and that makes it much easier. So the first thing I learned, there are a lot of legal issues. The second thing we learned is that there are cultural sensitivities. So we also had to check the content, but we also had to check what we are making available of the recordings, and some recordings are culturally sensitive. So if you listen to them, somebody can get sick, for example, etc. So you have to be very carefully of how to handle that. And again, you need for that networks of researchers. And the third issue was to somehow, because you cannot ask Nachfahren, descendants, gracias. Thank you. Any descendants of those who have been recorded 100 years ago? How should we do? So what we decided is not to make it downloadable, and in that sense, neither the text nor the recordings, and in that sense, you can listen to it, you can read it, you can have a look at it, but you cannot download it in order to somehow be cautious. Yeah? But that issue of the legal regimes of the object is fundamental. All the collections we have are national heritage of Germany. So an anchor is put to the object. They cannot circulate freely. They need permission, particularly if they circulate outside of the European Union. There's one person in the Senate of the state of Berlin giving the permissions. Yeah? During, I think, 2 years, we had illegally circulating books because we have a lot of loans between libraries. Secondly, we are member of DFG, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, so we subscribe open science. So it's free circulation, but within the scientific community. We are obliged, if we are using financial support from Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, the German Ministry for Research, Technology and Space, etc., Volkswagen Stiftung, to make it available in the sense of open science. And then we have cultural sensitivity. So that is, I think, that there are incommensurabilities between regimes. And if you remember that we have only 2 professors for legal anthropology in German-speaking countries, you can sense how complicated it is to mediate between those regimes. So you have to make, again, decisions. Take out what might be photographs, what might be cultural sensitive, or recordings, but at the same time not pretending to be able to ask everybody, because then you would never put this online. Now should we click it, or maybe?
You want to go back to the presentation?
No, I was only wondering if people want to see more than this, or
Scroll down.
you can scroll down. There you see the wax cylinders. This is in our collections. You can choose the language you want. You get also, and then you see the recordings, and then you can click, and then you will go to the last part where you can listen. So I recommend everybody to do this. And I would also like to mention that the wax cylinder from Karl Theodor Preuss, the recordings of Karl Theodor Preuss from Colombia, particularly not only Kogi but also other ethnic groups of Sierra Santa Marta, will not be published in this way, because there we have already a collaborative regime shift. Our colleague Stefanie Schirn is publishing them jointly with the Kogi communities and other ethnic groups. So it will not become a book or something in a digital collection that is authored by us and coordinated by us, but it will be a joint curatorship. So I think that is also interesting to mention. And now we go back to the presentation, but very quickly, because we are a little bit late of time. Thank you. Oh, you're helping me. That's great. No, yeah, because I'm a little bit. And we should say that these are the first CDs and publication put online. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I already mentioned this. This is recognition of our colleagues and friends who have been the brokers, also the authors of many of the booklets, but also who have been working on the historical recordings. And if you have listened to the recordings, for somebody as me, I'm a blunt anthropologist, not an ethnomusicologist. So if you want to recirculate this, it's also a challenge. And the Phonogramm-Archiv takes only recordings for 3 minutes. So if you have ritual songs, people had to put the head into that. Many of them, as we know from the field diary of Theodor Preuss, with a little bit of alcohol. So you put your head into this thing, yeah? Then it's 3 minutes, and your ritual dance is much longer. So it's like a rap, like it's really cutted. And when we did a process of recirculation, we had to. This has to be reappropriated because, of course, it was really cut it down, the ritual. And of course, for all anthropologists, we know a ritual song is a song that is performed with clothes, with music, with song, and with movement. And the recording is not capturing that. So in that sense, it's also a huge difficulty how to make that accessible. And of course, you need colleagues and friends who have this long-term. I'm very happy that Virginia is here. Virginia Jack-Dash, she is, because she is one of the broker behind one of the CDs. And of course, these processes of recirculation are complicated. We did that with one CD, with the financial support of the Foreign Ministry of Mexico, so we could produce 5,000 CDs. And we went back to the place where this has been recorded. It was quite interesting. We went back to the ritual experts, and it's a reappropriation, but of course a CD, when people have mobile phones. It's also a little bit difficult. And you have this reappropriation circulation. This is the case of Robert Lehmann-Nietzsche, of indigenous communities who are re-signifying their ethnic identity, and they're using all these material, but they are re-signifying it, historical photographs or recording. And I think that is what now Walter will tell us, and I would like to introduce him briefly so that we can continue. But in order to do so, I just capture my thing. Walter Maradiere, who now will give us an insight on the project Listening with and Beyond the Archive, the return of Heinrich Brüning's recordings, the ones where Virginia had such an important role. He's anthropologist. He studied in Peru at La Universidad Nacional Pedro Ruiz Gallo, Lambayeque, the place where Brüning is from. So then in some sense this is also a recirculation of your own person and history. The Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, Northwestern University, where he did his, Evanston, Illinois, where he did his PhD. You have been visiting professor in Carleton College, Northfield. You had been part, as postdoctoral researcher of DFG-funded project, co-organized by Ingrid Kummels and Gisela Canepa-Koch from Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, and you will give us some insights on that. And now you are the junior research group leader of the Eminöta project. Eminöta is considered to be the small Nobel Prize for new-coming researchers in the German system. There are 7 Eminöta programs that have been awarded. I'm very happy that Walter is one of them. Archival Sovereignty, Indigenous Digital Media, Language Revival and Land Defense in the Andes, which is a project that just started attached to University of Bonn. Welcome again, and I think the floor is yours. Thank you also for your patience.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for being here. First of all, I want to say that what I'm presenting here is part of preliminary conclusions that we are that I'm working together with Professor Gisela Canepa-Koch. from the Universidad Católica del Perú in Lima. That's why in many moments of this presentation sometimes I say I, sometimes I say we, but the idea is like we are thinking together this. So, and also this is part of a project that includes both ethnographic and archival research, both in Peru and Germany, and that's why I'm really thankful for the help that we had in the Phonogramm-Archiv in Berlin with Maurice Mengel and of course Albrecht Wittmann, who were always very generous and opened their archives and offices for us at more than one time, both in Dahlem and at the Humboldt Forum. And of course, thank you for the invitation to Barbara and Martina for arranging this. So I will start reading. In this presentation, we inspect the constitution and transformations of the sound collection of Heinrich Brüning, a German scientist based in Peru in the early 20th century. We argue that a sound archive is constituted by, and at the same time is constitutive of ways of knowing the world through sound, that is, of acoustic epistemologies and sound documentation practices. This involves dynamic processes influenced by the actions of multiple actors and their own work. I will analyze 4 events that we refer to as archival interventions. First, we identify the epistemologies that resonate in Brüning's sound recordings and in his recording decisions. We then argue that the network of transnational encounters and exchanges of objects, techniques, and knowledge did not finish with the formation of this connection, as the digital space is creating new avenues for intervention and listening to the records. Heinrich Brüning spent 50 years in Peru, initially hired as an engineer on sugar plantations in the northern region. As a self-trained researcher in anthropology, archaeology, and history, he assembled a substantial collection consisting of hundreds of pre-Columbian objects and historical, legal, and journalistic documents, some 2,000 photographs, and 21 wax cylinders with music recordings that were deposited in the Berlin Phonographic Archive in 1928. We recuperate the concept of acoustic epistemologies, which Stephen Feld defines as culturally and ontologically constituted modes of listening through which knowledge is produced and subjectivities are configured in a relational way. In this sense, we understand that Brüning's ethnographic sound project is immersed in a web of relationships between anthropologists, other academics, and local communities that developed their own forms of documentation, shaping its relevance until the present. These relational modes of listening and recording are also mediated by the musical instruments and recording devices that are part of the ethnographic encounter. We also emphasize the ways in which the racialization of people, instruments, musical genres, and territories influence epistemological practices of listening and sound documentation. Brüning's sound ethnography project began in 1908 when he initiated an exchange with musicologist Erich von Hornbostel from the Berlin Phonographic Archive. Brüning shared information about pre-Columbian musical instruments with descriptions, drawings, photographs, and ceramic pieces from his archaeological collection, as Hornbostel had a special interest in these instruments for the study of the so-called Inca music. So with these objects, we are also trying to think and rethink what is a sound archive. And we want to think that together with the sound recordings, these are also part of a sound archive in some way. And so you have here the pre-Columbian objects that Brüning sent to Hornbostel and that are now preserved in the Ethnologisches Museum Berlin. This is a piece of one of the letters that they exchange. Then you also have one of the many photographs that Brüning took about music in general. So we want to think of a sound archive as an assemblage of objects that are related to sound. not only a sound recording. And that's how we are studying this collection. At the same time, Hornbostel gave him recommendations on the appropriate equipment and export companies to order a phonograph and wax cylinders to Peru. He also introduced Brüning to his studies in comparative musicology and the sound recording methodologies developed as part of the archives, the Phonogram-Archiv, to create an archive of world music for the purpose of classifying and comparing musical instruments. This exchange of correspondence and sound objects was part of transatlantic and global epistemological agendas. On the one hand, Hornbostel established a similar exchange with the scholars around the world, as has already been explained, collaborations that helped to form what is now the Berlin Phonographic Archive. On the other hand, Brüning used this exchange to expand his theoretical and methodological knowledge about music and develop his own argument about the continuity of the indigenous Muchik society of pre-Columbian origin. With this knowledge, Brüning made his recordings in two periods, between 1910 and 1911 in the coastal town of Eten. So here you have a map of Peru with Lambayeque in red, and here you have Bigger, and there you have Eten and Lambayeque with like the places where he made the recordings. 1910 and 11 in Eten, where he was living since 1906, because he was also studying the Muchik indigenous language, and between 1923 and 1925 in the coastal city of Lambayeque. The first period includes recordings of the flauta y cajita, played by a single musician, and the chirimía y caja, played by two musicians, which are performed in festive contexts such as dances and processions. The second period includes genres that Brüning records as serranitas, marineras, guainos, and tristes, usually played in social gatherings. During this period, Brüning recorded pieces performed by wind instruments, leaving aside percussions, even though they are crucial for musicians and dancers and the audience to recognize the genre and its social function. Therefore, Brüning would have prioritized the instrumental characteristic over the genre when making the recordings. I should say that in this part, of course, Virginia's study on the Brüning's recordings was super helpful, because neither Gisela or I are musicologists. So and now it's great that you will have access also not only to the recordings but also to the booklet that came with Brüning's CD. A number of dimensions are interwoven in such decisions. The first has to do with Hornbostel's interest in wind instruments of pre-Columbian origin as the basis for a notion of an idea of indigenous music, an interest that Brüning reinterprets towards his own agenda of finding the remaining vestiges of Muchik culture. With regard to a second dimension, Brüning classified his recordings as indigenous music from northern Peru, regardless of the geographical origin of the musicians, instruments, and genres. For example, the chirimía, which is of European and Middle Eastern origin, is part of the group of recordings that include the quena, pincuyo, caja, and cajita. Brüning combined the coast and the highlands of Lambayeque as part of a large indigenous region, which contrasted with the hegemonic georacial imagination in Peru that, since the late 19th century, distinguished ethnic groups and musical repertoires of the Mestizo coast from the indigenous highlands. So the idea is, like in Peru, like the intelligentsia of Peru, like since the late 19th century, was already distinguishing between a Mestizo coast and indigenous highlands. But in Brüning's project, this difference didn't much exist, and he classified everything as indigenous music. And we saw that there are consequences for this. A second dimension is technological. The phonograph had limitations in optimally recording all types of instruments. Percussion instruments tended to drown out the sound of wind instruments. while it was only possible to make recordings of no more than 3 minutes. Famous for his desire to achieve technical perfection in the use of the phonograph, this probably influenced Brüning's decision to record only the quena and the flute in the second period, avoiding the cajita and the brass band altogether. At the same time, he must have agreed with the musicians to perform shortened or compressed musical pieces, something related to what Barbara was explaining, influencing the musical structures performed by Andean musicians. These collaborations not only refer to negotiations between Brüning and the musicians, but also must have involved the agency of the indigenous performers, their skills and musical knowledge. This cultural and political context, technical expertise, capabilities, and academic interests were involved in the scientific agendas, technological mediation, and modes of racialization of the time, and shaped the way in which Brüning listened to the soundscape of the region and designed the sound recordings of his early archival interventions. Since the 1990s, the Brüning Sound Collection has been part of a series of archival interventions, mainly digital, that have reinscribed it in new cultural and epistemological dynamics. 20 of the 21 musical recordings, one is believed to have been lost in the midst of so many moves, as Maurice was explaining, were digitized and then published in 2006 by the Berliner Phonogramm-Archiv on a CD entitled Cylinder Recordings from Peru, 1910-1925, together with a booklet in German and Spanish. At the time of its release, the CD was not distributed to audiences in northern Peruvian communities. However, some informal copies without the booklet subsequently circulated among a few musicians, dancers, and experts of the tradition in Lambayeque. Despite the limitations of access for a wider audience, since 2013, Brüning's recordings have been the subject of a third intervention, finding a means of dissemination via the Internet, a task undertaken by actors outside of the phonographic archive. In 2013, Peruvian musicologist Chalena Vázquez published curated versions of the recordings on YouTube and SoundCloud. Designed as video clips, Vázquez complements the audio tracks with images of Brüning and other sources that provide information about the recording, including her own musicological notes, thus proposing a curation alternative to that of the CD. Although this publication transgressed the access policies of the German archive, it can be understood as an early initiative to repatriate the sound archives to the digital space by making them available to a wider audience of academics, musicians, and interested parties in Peru. As a final intervention of the ones that I'm mentioning now, we identify the one made by the musical group Tierra Adentro, a folk group from Lambayeque founded in the 1990s. In 2021, the group received a grant from the Peruvian Ministry of Culture to make concerts under the title, translated to English, Traditional Music of Northern Peru, recorded by Heinrich Brüning. In Lambayeque, they constantly translate also the name. So in Lambayeque, he's Heinrich Brüning, between 1910 and 1925. Brüning's sound recordings had been heard in the region for at least 10 years. However, this was the first time that the musical pieces were to be performed on stage. Based on the fieldwork we developed between 2022 and 23, we would like to highlight two central ideas regarding this recent archival intervention. The first has to do with the omission of these instruments and their musical genres identified as serranos, that is, from the highlands, and closer to indigeneity in the contemporary racial imagination in Peru. Made by previous compilations of northern music, like music from northern Peru, produced by contemporary musicians and researchers. This oversight in the region refers to a dissonance between the geo-racial imagination implicit in Brüning's sound project and contemporary agendas where the division between the Mestizo Coast and the indigenous highlands remains prevalent. In this sense, the archival intervention of Tierra Adentro is significant because the group decided to present the concerts in the coastal districts of Eten and Lambayeque, where Brüning made his recordings in the early 20th century. In tension with this prevailing racial imagination, during these concerts, which we see as an archival intervention exercise with discursive and scenic performance, the members of Tierra Adentro emphasized that this music was, quote-unquote, returning to its original recording location. Likewise, in the introductions to each song, they repeated that this was, quote-unquote, our music being played, quote-unquote, again, right? Linking a sound community that does not deny indigenous sonority. This archival intervention began with the preliminary work of analyzing, transcribing, and producing the pieces that were performed at the concert. As Edmundo Chapoñán and Pedro Bardales, the group's director and musical director respectively, explained, during the first listening sessions of the CD, they were able to detect some seemingly atypical characteristics in Brüning's recordings, at least from the point of view of contemporary Andean music. For example, they were initially puzzled by the fact that the recorded serranitas did not have a phrase structure that alternated every 2 or 3 repetitions. On the contrary, in the recordings, each phrase alternates only after 1 repetition. They suggest that this could be explained by the limited recording time required by the phonograph, about 3 minutes, and the musician's desire to give a sense of wholeness to the piece by performing different phrases within a reduced time frame. These differences could be related to the acoustic epistemologies and current modes of performance prevalent in northern Peru and how they influence the current listening experience of Brüning's recordings. In other words, contemporary listening practices, performance, and sound knowledge in this region interact in encounters and disagreements, encuentros y desencuentros, with the sound knowledge contained in Brüning's recordings and require contextualized listening methodologies. With regard to past archival interventions, those developed by the musicians of Tierra Adentro were not exclusively academic, but also musical and performative. These objectives are intertwined with their interest in recontextualizing these records with the regional soundscape that nowadays does not usually identify with these musical genres and instruments. Oh, I didn't know I just put this very briefly because it's amazing, because he was playing with the digital version of Brüning's recording. He was playing the guitar. Yeah. Okay. Transatlantic exchanges create networks where people, objects, and knowledge circulate in hierarchical political and epistemological conditions between Europe and Latin America. Therefore, we can affirm that the formation of Brüning's collection and the archival interventions that have given a new meaning to it are the result of acoustic epistemologies, ethnographic documentation, and modes of listening that have circulated between the Andes and Europe since the early 20th century. Additionally, since the 21st century, the digital realm has become a third space for these networks. Here, new agents participate with their own agendas, which sometimes question or complicate European predominance or relate to the archival interventions of indigenous musicians from 1910. In the case of the sound archive, its sonority, materiality, and mediality are all intervened in the digital space, which modifies contemporary practices of listening and circulation and influence the new identity and political conditions in the Peruvian Andes. The 4 archival interventions we just described reveal that the ways of producing knowledge through sound and listening practices are constantly being re-signified and appropriated by the actions of diverse actors in their own cultural and political context, and by technological mediations that are also changing and will likely to continue to foster future archival interventions. So we will have to also think about our interventions and what our interventions are doing for the circulation of these recordings. But this is something that we will think about in the future, as this is an ongoing work. Thank you.